So welcome everyone, welcome to our guest invited speaker. We are very honored and very happy to have with us you, Professor Stiglitz, today at this EoF lesson and this EoF summer school lesson. We are here live in Gubbio together with 30 amazing young scholars attending this school at the first EoF summer school. I suddenly leave the floor to Professor Luigino Bruni, who is going to introduce us towards this fantastic lesson.
Thank you very much, Valentina. Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. Thank you, Professor Stiglitz, for your presence with us. We are very honored to have you here with us because we know your contributions to many of the topics, issues of our Economy of Francesco programs, and then to have you in person, because online is one form of being in person today, and to present an issue that is very central in our summer school, in our program, then the issue of inequality. As we know, and you will, you know much better than me, that inequalities, in plural, inequalities are growing during and after this COVID crisis, not just in most evident domains like food, like health, but also in for dimensions related directly to work. Today, maybe tomorrow, there are people like me that I'm a teacher that can benefit from at distance classroom, at distance lectures, and maybe we can conciliate much more tomorrow our family needs with our work needs. But there are other jobs like cleaners or builders that cannot work at distance. And then the inequality in society will also increase for this maybe non-intentional outcome of our COVID. But just to say how much complex is the issue of inequality, and in particular the relationship between COVID crisis, economy, economics, and inequality. But I stop here. I give again the microphone to Valentina to introduce our next guest.
So, thank you, Luigino. As you might know, one of the villages which were related to this process, which is the economy of Francesco, was called CO2 of inequalities, where the CO2 was, in a sense, those kind of aspects which are good up to a certain level and which become really an issue when they overcome a certain threshold. So among this village, we had the chance to have a fantastic colleague who's working now at the Dicastery for Integral Human Development, which name is Marta Pedrajas, who's live with us today, and who's going to introduce you to Professor Stiglitz. So now I leave the floor to Marta. Just a quick recap of today's lesson. Now Marta will give an introduction to the lesson, and then we will have Professor Stiglitz talking to us about inequalities in the post-COVID era, and then after that we will have two young discussants from the economy of Francesco, which will pose some questions and discuss Professor Stiglitz's talk. Professor, this is not something we want to explain, but we really have in mind the idea of young people grasping as much as they can the most important part of your expertise, and try to give you their view about not of course your expertise, but the way we can apply your expertise to our own life and the life of the entire world. So thank you so much also for being able to discuss with us through this process. So Marta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Valentina. and Professor Eugenio Bruni. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning in the US. Buenas tardes a todos. Buonasera in Gubbio. I'm very happy to be part of this summer school today. Thank you for inviting me to moderate this session. And welcome to all of you to this extraordinary session that this is extraordinary because we have an extraordinary speaker, as we have been already told. Thank you very much, Valentina and Professor Eugenio Bruni. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning in the US. Buenas tardes a todos. Buonasera in Gubbio. I'm very happy to be part of this summer school today. Thank you for inviting me to this session. I'm sorry, but I have double sound now, and it's a little bit uncomfortable, but we have an extraordinary speaker. So this is Professor Stiglitz doesn't need an introduction. He's a very well-known speaker, author, writer, professor. But I want to highlight some of the great achievements of his curriculum to make all of us aware of this contribution to our summer school. Professor Stiglitz is an American economist, professor at the Columbia University, where he has received also the Nobel Prize of Economics in 2001. Previously, he has received other prizes like the John Bates Clark Medal in 1979. He's a former vice president and chief economist of the World Bank and former member of the US President Council of Economic Advisors. He has been professor in the best universities in the world, PhD from MIT, professor in Yale. He has taught in Princeton, Stanford, MIT, Oxford, and currently in Columbia University, in the economic department, in the business school, and in the School of International and Public Affairs, where he also founded the Initiative for Policy Dialogue. He is also co-chair of the high-level expert group on measurement of economic performance and social progress at the OECD, and member of other international working groups in the international organization, like in the UN, in the panel of experts of climate change. He has worked in the reforms of the IMF and in the international economics. He's also chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. Entering now in the main contribution, the economic science, and for all of us to be aware of his contributions to the global debate of the international economic, he helped create the branch of economics called the economics of information, and has made major contributions to macroeconomics and monetary theory, development economics and trade theory, public and corporate finance, to the theories of industrial organization, to the theories of welfare economics, income and wealth in distribution. He's a very well-known writer and author. In the last 15 years, he has written a series of high popular books that have had an enormous influence in the global debate. For mentioning some of them, Globalization and its Discontents from 2002 that has been revisited in 2017. And has been translated into 35 languages, and he's selling maybe more than 1 million copies of that book. His more recent titles, Rewriting the Rules of the European Economy from 2020, with other authors, with Pituche and Durand, Measuring What Counts, the Global Movement for Well-being, and with the same authors, For Good Measure, an Agenda for Moving Beyond GDP. That is also a very important debate for the economy of Francesco community. People, Power and Profits in 2019, Rewriting the Rules of the American Economy, and very, very famous books in the previous 2000s, The Great Divide, The Price of Inequalities, Making Globalization Work. He has been widely recognized with more than 40 honorary doctorates, including Oxford, Cambridge, and several prestigious prizes. He's Fellow of the National Academy of Science, American Academy of Arts and Science, American Philosophical Society, Fellow of the Royal Society, the British Academy. He has been decorated by several governments, including Colombia, Ecuador, Korea, and member of the France Legion of Honor. And today is our honor. He's a fellow of the Economy of the Francesco Summer School, and we are very proud and very privileged to have him with us, with our young scholar, with our young economists from all over the world that are ready to listen, to learn, to debate, and to be part of this change in international economics. This conference is about the importance of inequalities in the contemporary world, no? Affected by the post-pandemic era. So, Professor Stiglitz, we are eager to listen to you, to learn from you. Thank you very much for being here with us today, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to begin with some perspectives from one of my recent books, People, Power, and Profits, that gives a broader perspective on the economy, and then I'll go from there into the specific question of inequality. One of the things I argue in that book is that a successful society and a successful economy needs to have a balance between individual actions and collective action. That's a somewhat different perspective than is traditionally talked about in economics. One of the most influential authors in economics was Adam Smith, writing almost 250 years ago, where he talked about the power of the invisible hand, that the individuals in the pursuit of their own interest acted as if there were an invisible hand that led them to act in ways that maximize societal well-being. One of the, I view as my own work, was to show that Adam Smith, the way I sometimes put it is that the reason the invisible hand often seems invisible is that it's not there. And the pursuit of self-interest often leads not to societal well-being, but to calamities like the 2008 financial crisis, the problems of the opioid crisis in the United States, the environmental disasters that we face, the childhood obesity crisis in the United States from the food companies, and I could go on and on. Actually, Adam Smith himself was aware that the invisible hand that he talked about was just a small part of the story. He himself recognized that there was a really very important role for collective action, particularly dealing with issues of education, equality, that the market often does not treat workers well, and that there needed to be an important role for the state in protecting workers. So while many people on the right invoke Adam Smith, if Adam Smith were here, he would be arguing against them. He understood the limitations of the invisible hand. So most of the important issues that we face today in the 21st century, the key aspects that contribute to our well-being require some forms of collective action. Many of these revolve around externalities. Externalities entail actions by one person that can harm another. And because individuals without restraint may do engage in that kind of harm, we need to prevent that, and that requires collective action. In some ways, if we go back to the beginnings of civilization, to the 10 Commandments, they are regulations necessary to make a society function. Thou shalt not steal. That's a restriction on what you can do. It's a regulation. It's a regulation because if you steal from other people, society won't be able to function. And individuals won't have an incentive to invest, they'll spend all of their resources protecting what they have. And that is very inefficient. So the 10 Commandments, which said, thou shalt not steal, was an important advance in civilization. This is particularly important when it comes to interacting with the commons, one of the themes I know of your school. One aspect of the commons is the environment. And one important aspect of the environment, obviously, is climate change, global warming. We have to learn how to live within our planetary boundaries. And nothing about the standard market economy ensures that that is true. In fact, we have not been living within our planetary boundaries. Without government regulations, people will abuse the commons. They'll put too much pollution into the atmosphere. They'll pollute the waters. And we see that happening in our oceans, in our atmosphere. So you need collective action. In the case of climate change, we need global collective actions in order for us to appropriately protect our commons. The health crisis, actually, that we're going through, COVID-19, is actually, at the center of it, is an externality. You don't have to use the economist language, but I think it's useful to understand many of the controversies surrounding COVID-19 in terms of externalities. If an individual does not engage in social distancing, wearing a mask, getting vaccinated, it increases the probability that he will infect somebody else. And so he creates, or she creates, that externality. In some countries, there's been this mistaken view of talking about individual liberties, that requiring vaccines or requiring masks or requiring social distancing is an infringement on an individual's liberties. But one person's freedom is another person's unfreedom. Giving somebody the right to walk around without a mask or walk around without vaccination is taking away another person's right to live, because it increases the risk that they will be contaminated, get the disease, and die, or otherwise suffer from the disease. So to me, this debate that has been going on about controlling the disease, about whether we should require vaccines or social distancing or vaccinations or masks, is a non-brainer. It's a no-brainer. It's obvious that the infringements on liberties of requiring a vaccine are minuscule compared to the harm that not having that requirement can do to our society. And so in that way, this COVID, what we're going through, illustrates very strongly the importance of collective action for societal well-being. Of course, it's more than just preventing harms. It's doing good. We can collectively, do collectively more than we can do individually. The sum is greater, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And the pandemic again illustrates. In record time, we developed vaccines. And those vaccines were remarkably effective in protecting us against the disease. But remember, these vaccines were developed so quickly because there had been a collective effort providing from government money for research that first developed our understanding of DNA and then developed mRNA and did all the basic research that enabled in a few weeks for us to develop the vaccines. So I know the private sector likes to talk about its achievement in developing the vaccine, and it was an achievement. But let's not forget the fact that that achievement rested on billions of dollars and years of public effort, collective effort, in engaging in research that provided the basis of where we are today. So it's only collectively that we can ensure that there's opportunity for all, a basic ingredient of what we should view as a good society. Markets on their own won't ensure either equality or equality of opportunity. This brings me to one of my earlier books, which was called The Price of Inequality. And there were two themes there that I emphasize that I think are important as we think about inequality in the post-COVID world. The first is that, or three themes. The first is that the idea, very popular in America, that America was the American dream, that everybody has an equal chance. The data do not support that. The life prospects of a young American, for instance, are more dependent on the income and education of his parents or her parents than in almost any other of the advanced countries. There are only two other countries that compete with the United States for lack of opportunity in terms of the usual statistics. One is UK, and the other one is Italy. So the fact is that being a rich country doesn't ensure equality of opportunity. And in fact, being a rich country doesn't ensure that even most citizens are doing well. If you ask the question, if you were randomly dropped by a helicopter in different countries, where would you prefer to be dropped? Take two countries next to each other, United States and Canada. Well, the answer is in part depends on if you knew you were going to be dropped in the 1% or the 1/10%, United States is a great place. If you're going to be Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates, life is wonderful. But if you are dropped randomly, it's a lot better to be dropped into Canada. To put it another way, the median standard of living, the median real income is higher in Canada than in the United States. The average is higher in the United States, but the average is brought up by the huge incomes and wealth of people like at the very, very top. The magnitude of the inequalities in the United States are just horrendous. The top three people, all men, have as much. Now, actually, they're divorced and shared with their ex-wives. But those top 5, 6 people have as much wealth as close to the bottom half. So it just shows you the magnitude of the inequalities. The second important lesson that I talked about in my book, The Price of Inequality, is that our society pays a high price for this inequality. It used to be said that if we were would try to get rid of that inequality, we would pay a price. Arthur Okun, who was one of my predecessors as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors way back under President Johnson, wrote an influential book at the time called The Big Trade-Off, where he said, if you want more inequality, you're going to have to give up in economic performance and economic growth. The evidence today is quite the contrary. You can get better economic performance if you have a more equal society. And that has to do, to a large extent, with the ways, the extremes of inequality that I mentioned before, and the ways in which inequality arises. Historically, there's been a controversy over two alternative mechanisms, sources of the inequalities, so oversimplifying, but basically, one is that it arises out of exploitation. And the other is that it is just deserts. That is to say, those at the top have contributed more to society, and they're just getting back an amount reflecting their greater contribution. Well, today, the evidence is overwhelming that at least a very, very large fraction of the inequalities that exist today arise from exploitation of market power, individual vulnerabilities. We saw that in the financial crisis. All the examples I gave before are all examples of exploitation, somebody taking advantage of others. A lot of the inequality in the United States is a result of the way we've written the rules of the game. If we look across different advanced countries, we see marked differences in the levels of inequality and the levels of inequality of opportunity. And that tells us it is not technology, it is not globalization that is driving the inequalities. All the advanced countries are confronting globalization, they're all confronting advances in technology. But how we manage these globalization, how we manage technology, depends on the rules of the game. And in the United States and in some other countries, those rules of the game have been, I would put it, rigged. They enable more market power, abuses of market power, and they've taken away the bargaining power of workers. And the result of that is high levels of inequality. And so by rewriting the rules of the economy, we can get more equality and better economic performance. And so that finally brings me circling back to the pandemic and inequality in the post-pandemic world. As I said, we went into the pandemic with high levels of inequality, but the pandemic both exposed and aggravated those inequalities. We saw it over and over again in so many dimensions. The disparate ways in which the pandemic was experienced by various parts of our society. At the bottom, frontline workers that were providing health services, that were doing other essential services, had low incomes and were more exposed to the disease and died in much higher numbers. People at the top could go on working on Zoom, receiving high incomes, facing little unemployment and little stress. You see it in the data on their children. Children moved to Zoom education. The children of lower income people wound up suffering enormously. Children of higher income people did better. The disease was not an equal opportunity virus. It went after people with health vulnerabilities. And a country like the United States, where we don't have a good public health care system, health conditions on average are not very good. That's why the United States has the lowest life expectancy of any major advanced country and the largest disparities in health conditions. And that provided a fertile field for COVID-19 to go after so many people with those conditions. We didn't have in our system a good ways of social protection. So the United States, unlike most other countries, does not provide for sick leave. And then the lack of humanity by our corporations was evident that when Congress tried to pass legislation to say, at least for COVID-19, let's have everybody have insurance if they get sick, pay sick leave. We don't want sick workers with COVID-19 going to work and spreading the disease, both to their customers and their fellow workers. The major companies in the United States waged a major campaign, and successfully so, to exempt them from the mandate of providing paid sick leave. So the result of this was that some 84% of American workers were not covered by paid sick leave. And that shows you it was a lack of humanity, but it was also foolish. And it was one of the reasons why COVID-19 hit this country, the United States, so badly, with now almost 700,000 deaths. Well, the legacy of this crisis can be twofold. It has aggravated the inequalities, but it's also awakened us up to the magnitudes of those inequalities. So at this moment, the Biden administration is working hard to address those. In the first act of the administration, the American Rescue Act, provisions were included that are anticipated to reduce childhood poverty by 50% in 1 year. That's heroic. And in the next pieces of legislation, there will be a transformation that could move America closer to what you might call a normal social democracy, where people care for each other. So to me, this is a moment of potential change. The politics in America are ugly, so I don't want to pretend that it will inevitably pass. There is one of our two parties is committed to undermining democracy and making it more difficult to vote, and undermining the rights of workers and creating more inequality. Hopefully, we know that most Americans do not agree with that. And so the question for us largely is, can we make our democracy work? And so that our democracy reflects the values of most Americans, which are to create a more equal society and address the multiple other crises that we face. Not only the inequality crisis, the health crisis that I talked about, but also the climate crisis, the political and social divisions that are tearing apart our societies. All of these will require solidarity and cooperation. They will require new visions of what we mean by a good society and new understandings of how we achieve that. It is clear that the neoliberal experiment of the past 40 years, an experiment that in the United States began under Reagan and the UK began under Thatcher, that experiment of 40 years has been a failure. It has led to lower growth and higher inequality. Hopefully, at this point, as the failures of that experiment become more evident, we will take another turn. What gives me a lot of optimism is that there are so many young people who recognize that failure and are committed to having our society turn in a different direction. So I hope my remarks have helped to provide some of the conceptualizations necessary to move us in a direction of an alternative to the failed, quote, experiment of the last 40 years, the excessive focus on markets, and trying to create not only a different conceptualization of the market and our economy, but a different conceptualization of our society and our politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz, for this wonderful conference and contribution to our debate. I'm giving back the floor to Valentina. Maybe she can handle the debate within the room in Gubbio. So Valentina.
Thank you, Marta, and thank you, Professor Stiglitz, for this really amazing talk. So we are here without words, but we have two discussants which were more prepared and which are actually more prepared and are working on this topic since long time. So I introduce you to Cristina and to Mateus, who's going to ask you some questions from the Economy of Francesco audience. So Cristina, please go first.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz, for your great lecture. It is an honor to have you with us today. My question is about the main goal of the Francesco economy is to change the world into a better place, as you are talking about in your presentation. And to do that, we must think of another economy that comprehends the problems of people, and mainly the marginalized and the environment. In 2009, in the report for the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance, you talked about the policymaker, that the decision they and we as individual citizens make depend on what we measure, how good our measurements are, and how well our measures are understood. We are almost blind when the metrics on which action is based are ill-designed or when they are not well understood. For many purposes, we need better metrics. Fortunately, research in recent years has enabled us to improve our metrics, and it's time to incorporate in our measurement system some of these advances. Due to that, my first question is, what kind of metrics and politics do you suggest? Thinking in this great recession that you are talking about, and that we are passing through, and the global crisis that impacts in different aspects of the economy and the society, like the labor market with increasing of informal and unemployed workers, mainly in the global south, the care crisis with the aging population and the crisis in social security systems, the environmental depletion, as you said, and the climate change, and the indebtedness of the states, mainly in the global south. And my second question is, which is related to the first one, is how to control the financial system. Even with the 2009 crisis, the financial speculation is increasing, and we fail to develop a controlling system for speculative capital. This will probably lead to another crisis in the system that will impact mainly in the poor population around the world. and increases the poverty and inequality. So thinking about that, my second question is, it is possible to change these characteristics of the capitalist system? Don't you think that the financial speculation and the inequality and the lack of democracy, mainly in the global south, is structural and functional for the capitalist system? Thank you, Professor.
Professor Stiglitz, you are muted. Sorry for this.
Yeah, great questions. Let me first begin with a measurement question. As you said, measurement is really important. What we measure affects what we do. What we argued in that book was that no single number can capture anything as complex as our society. You need to have a dashboard of indicators, different indicators that describe how well you're doing in different dimensions. So, for instance, I emphasize just because GDP is going up doesn't mean most citizens are doing well. So you have to have measures that reflect that inequality, what's happening to the median, what's happening to the people at the bottom, poverty. We aren't going to have a world of the future if we don't do something about climate change. So we have to talk about environmental sustainability, and we have to have measures that reflect that sustainability. We have to have measures that reflect the extent to which we are putting, emitting carbon into the atmosphere. Health is a basic part of our living standards, as we've experienced over the last 2 years. If we're worried every day about coming down with a possibly deadly disease, it's not a good thing. So health metrics have to be part of that dashboard. Security, too, is an important part of our well-being. If we worry every day about losing our job and what happens if we lose our job, do we lose our health insurance, do we lose, do we go sink into poverty? If we worry about being homeless, or if we worry about our retirement, we can't be productive, but we also aren't a good society. So our metrics have to reflect that kind of security. And in our more recent book in 2019, we dealt with ways of measuring that kind of security. So the important, one of the arguments that we put forward is that democratic societies need to have a robust debate about what are the things that they really care about, what are the things that really make for well-being, and making sure that there are metrics that reflect key aspects of that. To me, one of the aspects of well-being that we often took for granted was democracy. But in the United States, we no longer can take that for granted, as those in Republican states are facing the possibility of the right to vote being taken away from them or made much more difficult. And so there is a wholesale assault against our democracy. Your second question on the financial sector, I have been very concerned about the financial sector. Clearly, the financial sector brought the whole world economy down in 2008. And it was an enormous amount of work to pass regulations to try to make it more stable. The regulations we passed in the United States in 2010 were not adequate. But no sooner had they been passed than the financial sector started lobbying, spending money to make sure that there was a rollback in those regulations. So quite frankly, I agree with you today that we are not, there's no confidence that we might not have another crisis. And actually, a financial crisis could be related to the climate crisis. Our banks have been lending to the fossil fuel industry. And there are risks of their becoming stranded assets. The value of those assets will go down as we confront climate change. And that could give rise to another financial crisis. But I want to emphasize the other side. Not only have we not done as much as we should have done to restrict the financial sector from doing harm, we haven't done as much as we should have done to make sure that the financial sector does what it should do, which is, for instance, providing finance to small businesses, create jobs, to make a more dynamic economy. In fact, since the financial crisis, the amount of small business lending by our banks has gone down. To me, that is as worrying as the harms that the financial sector has imposed in the past.
Thank you so much, Professor Stiglitz. Mateus, how are you with us? Yes? So, please.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz, and for your time and for the words. Thank you for your presentation to us. It's an honor talking to you today. Well, reflecting a bit on what the professor recently wrote and talking about the mass vaccine distribution, corporate greed, and the temporary waiver of intellectual property rights, this lacks about the World Trade Organization rules. First, I ask your opinion on private property. Should the private property have limits? Talking about big fortunes. Next, I see the many scenarios of inequality in the world. For example, COVID vaccines distribution, income, gender, technology, and the others. I ask you, why have things failed under capitalism? What would be the priority actions in terms of public policies? Thank you, Professor.
Well, I'm very glad you raised the question of the intellectual property and the waiver at the WTO. It's been a real source of concern by me. And it is an example of how important it is to get the right rules of the game. We've been talking about inequalities. One of the major inequalities right now in the midst of COVID-19 are the inequalities in access to the vaccines. In the United States, anybody who wants access to a vaccine can get a vaccine. And in fact, beginning next month, anybody who wants a booster shot, not just 2 shots, but now we're talking about 3 shots, you can get that. In the developing world and emerging markets, people are literally dying for lack of access to a vaccine. The number of vaccinated people in the developing countries and emerging markets is minuscule. So this is one of the most iniquitous aspects of COVID-19. The question of the overall problem is twofold. A lot of emphasis on the money to help the developing countries purchase the vaccines. That's called COVAX. That's the international effort. But the real problem is lack of supply. And the question is, why is there that lack of supply? We've known that the vaccines were created very quickly after COVID-19 was discovered. And most of the time, from last February and March until now, has not been creating the vaccine. They were created very quickly. It's been testing. And it became very clear very early that these vaccines were very effective and very safe. Knowing that they were very effective and very safe, why didn't the market economy start expanding capacity to make sure that there were shots for all 7 billion people in the world? This is a massive market failure. Now, there are many hypotheses of why that market failed. One part of it is that restrictions on intellectual property, that hoarded that property, intellectual property in the rich countries. Interestingly, when the intellectual property provisions were first adopted by the WTO, there was a provision for compulsory licenses to make sure that if you ever faced a disease like the life-saving moment, you could force companies to give you access to that intellectual property. And then we discovered that those provisions were not flexible enough in response to HIV/AIDS. And then they were made more flexible. But then the drug companies who don't want access to their intellectual property found ways to blocking it. The point of the the IPR waiver is not changing the fundamentals of intellectual property. It's reducing the transaction cost. We're in an emergency now. There's urgency. As long as though there are large numbers of people with that disease, the probability of a mutation is increased, and that means a mutation that could be more dangerous, more contagious, vaccine resistant. It's in our self-interest that we wipe out this disease as fast as possible. And we managed, those of us who were engaged in this, managed to convince President Biden that was true. The drug companies were fighting on the other side. We won. And now the major impediment is Germany and some of the European countries. And some of the countries are afraid to stand up against Germany. So even though I know their heart is on our side, they don't want to contradict Germany. It is so selfish and so foolish what is going on. I believe that the markets, if you got rid of the intellectual property, could solve the supply problem. Even the former head of Moderna's research has said that with instruction, production could come online in a few months. India is a major producer of vaccines. So to me, the imperative going forward is we have to do everything that we can to increase the supply. It's a matter of self-interest for all of us in the advanced countries who have access, but it's also a matter of compassion for the well-being of everybody else in the world.
So, Professor Stiglitz, thank you so much. I just want you to hear this audience happiness. We are really very honored to have you among us today, and I am also sure that our colleagues all around the globe are very honored and happy to have the opportunity to at least hear your thoughts about this situation. Let me take the remaining, I'm sorry, we don't have time for questions, really live questions from the audience, but I'm sure we will have further opportunities. Let me take the last 2 minutes of this meeting, and I'm sorry, I didn't discuss this before with my colleagues and with Luigino, but let me take the last 2 minutes to share with you a scarf. Okay, this is a blue scarf, you see it? And we are wearing a blue piece of tissue, okay? This is nothing really important. It's really something which will help us. Why? Well, because in this moment we are taking the moment, we are grasping the intuition, we are really in line with what is happening in Afghanistan. So we are thinking about women, children, and men living there. We are feeling their pain. We are really compassionate, in a sense, using the words you were saying just a few minutes before. So we invite you and we invite the entire world community to wear something blue in the remaining days of their life, let's say of their days, of their months, to say to all over the world that we feel the pain of people in Afghanistan. Of course, we feel the pain of people everywhere, and we want to stand with them. So please, Professor Stiglitz, I see you are already wearing blue glasses, so thank you so much. But please become our advocate all over the world.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So guys, thank you, Cristina. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Mateus, for being with us. Thank you to the EoF community. Thank you to Maria and all the staff from EoF. You did a great job. And well, let's have a great day, evening, morning, wherever you are. Ciao.